Putin has to continue to try and play the idea that this is a war that Russia, on the one hand, has to take seriously because it's some kind of grand existential struggle for its place in the world and so forth, because he needs to talk it up to justify the sacrifices. But on the other hand, he's also trying to have to talk it down and say, yeah, it's an existential struggle, but it's no big deal. And don't worry, and everything's going to be fine and so forth. There is a tension there that, frankly, that Putin and the state are not really managing all that well. And so you have the legions of technocrats who are just trying to manage the country as best they can, constantly struggling against the demands and dictates of the Kremlin and of the war.
The day we're recording this, the 30th of September, is a somewhat significant date. Explain the significance.
Well, I mean, it's significant if you're looking at Russian government media, but I don't think significant for most Russians. It is notionally, it is the day of reunification. It is the anniversary day of the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian provinces, territories. And we've had Putin come out and give a speech. Interestingly, Putin has revived this term Novorossiya, New Russia, which is an old historical term for parts of eastern Ukraine. And back in 2014, when you had sort of various rebels and nationalists trying to use this term, the Kremlin absolutely did not want it to be used because it would kind of lock itself into a certain sort of policy position. But now, as ever, Putin will just simply scavenge through the history box for whatever he wants that will back his policies of the moment. So he has once again revived this term Novorossiya. And it's interesting because we are seeing a certain number of official events, particularly by regional leaders who want to curry favor. But a really striking level of indifference on the part of ordinary Russians, which really brings home this point that, if one goes back to 2014, when Crimea was annexed, there was a very genuine degree of enthusiasm because Crimea was this part of Ukraine that, frankly, every Russian, whether they were Putin supporters or indeed his ardent critics, genuinely thought was rightfully Russian. I wouldn't say no one, but very few people really think that about, well, wherever, Melitopol or even Donetsk, quite frankly. So there is this attempt to kind of crank up a degree of enthusiasm, but in fact, all it's really doing at the moment is demonstrating actually the degree to which Russians, they may still well be patriots and they don't want to see Russia humiliated or defeated. But when it comes down to it, it's not really a war they care about.
And that point about Russian public opinion is crucial. I mean, it's interesting. The Institute for the Study of War are reporting today that Putin is, as we shouldn't be surprised, going to look at defense spending increases for 2025, but is trying to kind of downplay that and play up increases in social spending. And is that because he is conscious that there is a risk if ordinary Russians feel as if their living standards are suffering to fund this war in Ukraine?
Yes, and of course, it's worth noting that in many cases, their living standards are already suffering and will suffer much more in the course of this war. Yes, it really sort of is a pattern that we've seen through the course of this year. I mean, earlier this year, for example, Putin very explicitly said to the Russian people, we will not repeat the mistakes made by the Soviet Union. In other words, that point at which the Soviet Union had concentrated so much on guns rather than on butter that essentially it spent itself into economic collapse. And it's worth noting that at its peak in peacetime, obviously wartime was even higher, but if at its peak in the late 70s, Soviet Union was spending twice as much a proportion of GDP on defense as today's Russia. So in that context, the slightly depressing conclusion is that there's a certain amount of room that can go. But of course, that was a very different time and a very different political situation. And today's Russians, they have memories of what their lives were like a few years ago. They have memories of what it was like when, not only could you be pretty certain that next year was going to be a more prosperous year for you than last year, but also you could, travel on holiday to the West and buy all sorts of Western goods without having to pay the additional surcharge to have it smuggled in and not have to worry about your iPhone not getting updated and all the other sort of what might sound petty and small-scale limitations on their lives, but which are very real ones. So I think in this context, yes, Putin has to continue to try and play the idea that this is a war that Russia, on the one hand, has to take seriously because it's some kind of grand existential struggle for its place in the world and so forth, because he needs to talk it up to justify the sacrifices. But on the other hand, he's also trying to have to talk it down and say, yeah, it's an existential struggle, but it's no big deal. And don't worry, and everything's going to be fine and so forth. There is a tension there that, frankly, that Putin and the state are not really managing all that well. And so you have the legions of technocrats who are just trying to manage the country as best they can, constantly struggling against the demands and dictates of the Kremlin and of the war. And so far, they have done, one has to recognize, actually a pretty good job of that. But as we see, for example, the central bank raising the base rates higher and higher, as we see inflation mounting, as we see labor pressures also increasingly great, and even as we see, I mean, the police are saying that depending on which location you're in, they're currently a quarter to a third under strength, simply because they can't recruit, because they're having to compete with the much higher salaries that are not just being paid by people who go and serve in the army, but even, frankly, people who then go and serve in defense industries, all of which are now having to offer enough money to attract sort of spare labor. So that sort of knocks on into sense of law and order. There's a rising crime rate, even before one factors in returning soldiers, scarred, traumatized, used to violence. We're similarly seeing, for example, paramedics. Paramedics are under strength, again, because you can go and be a medic in the army and double your salary. So, for all of this, actually, bit by bit, this war is absolutely eating into not just the fat, but the basic meat and sinews of the Russian state and social provision. But the point is that tends to be a lagging indicator. So at the moment, Putin is still slightly protected because it's not as if suddenly, bang, hospitals that don't have cleaners sort of have to be closed or whatever. No, it's just that they're just not as good, and people may well have more of a chance of catching MRSA or whatever else. But bit by bit, this is exactly how the Soviet Union slid into dissolution. But I have to say, in keeping with the modern times, it's on fast forward. Soviet Union could basically last 15 years before Gorbachev's attempts at reforms actually doomed it, and quite possibly could have lasted longer if it had a rather different type of leader. This kind of degradation, there's no way that it can go on for 20 years.
Well, on that note, I wanted to get your thoughts on an interview that the recently freed Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza gave to the Times only last week, in which he said that Putin's demise could come about when we least expected and potentially come around far more quickly than people think. What do you make of that, Mark?
I'm going to sit on the fence in some ways. On the one hand, look, he's absolutely right that we have to recognize the degree to which we are often very bad at predicting when these kind of authoritarian regimes finally break, because it tends to be a break. It's not a slow slide. It's suddenly things reach a kind of a critical mass of crisis, and all of a sudden people act. And if one looks, for example, at the elite, at the moment, of course, there is no question of any kind of serious elite coup or whatever against Putin, because the risks in doing so massively outweigh the risks in doing nothing. But on the other hand, we also have to accept this is an elite which is not a Putinist elite. These are not people who are kind of passionately committed to him as a man. They are just simply ruthless, self-interested opportunists who are constantly doing these cost-benefit analyses. And the result of that is, if something happened in the future, mass protests, economic collapse, whatever, that made enough of them change their mind, then momentum would probably swing against Putin. And that could happen very quickly. So on one level, I think Vladimir Kara-Murza is absolutely right. And look, this is a man who not only sort of understands from the real bowels of this system how it works, but also he's a historian. And he understands also Russia's historical trajectory and how regimes have collapsed quite unexpectedly and quickly. But the only little caveat I would throw in is that to some people, that can sometimes be an excuse. And I'm not saying this is obviously his intent, but to some people, this can be an excuse to basically think, well, we don't have to worry too much about this, because, this is a regime which is inevitably going to fall. And suddenly, there will be this deus ex machina, and surely some sort of Democrats will come to power, and then everything will be happy and nice. Of course, it's not necessarily going to be like that. Anyway, I mean, whoever comes to power after Putin Although I am unfashionably optimistic that it's not going to be a sort of a Putin 2.0, nor is it going to be a Kara-Murza or a Navalny. It's going to be someone from within the existing elite who will have good reasons to want to improve relations with the West and try and dial down the tensions just for their own pragmatic reasons. But they will still be self-interested kleptocrats. But as I said, given we don't know when it's going to be, we don't know exactly what the trajectory is going to be, we don't know who's going to emerge as a result, we can't really operate on that principle. If that happens, that happens. When it happens, that'll be great. But here and now, in some ways, we have to assume, just as Putin seems to assume, that he's going to be there forever and build our policies accordingly.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.